Hi, so we meet again in video format again. Thanks for your flexibility as we talk today about information graphics. We've been talking throughout the semester about graphical space, about the visual space of graphic communication. And we've been focused largely on writing systems, although we've looked at some other instances as well. I wanted to spend today's lecture talking about a different class of graphic communication, one that I'm calling information graphics, because information graphics have characteristics of pure images, but they also have characteristics of writing systems. There are words and images in both, and we've been talking all semester about that relationship between words and images in the graphical space of writing. I wanted to look in some detail at the history of information graphics and ask a similar set of questions about how is the graphic space being used, what's the relationship between word and image represented in each. I suppose the earliest of what we might call information graphics were geographic maps, and we haven't talked much. I mean, we've looked at a couple of maps this semester, mostly to place things in geography, but we haven't looked at maps themselves as a form of visual communication. The first maps date to the first cities. We find them in Mesopotamian cities. This is, for instance, one from Mesopotamia. You can see the cuneiform up there. But this down below is a map of the world. What makes something a map, the definition of a map, if you will, is a visual representation or a graphical representation of some physical part of the world, right? That's a pretty obvious definition of what a map is. And the reason I give you that definition is I want to try to figure out a way of defining some of the other visualizations, some of the other information graphics that we're going to look at. But we've seen this dates to 700 or so BCE. We found examples of maps from the first cities. And it makes sense. Mapping and writing in some ways are very closely allied to each other in that writing was an effort to capture speech in some form. Maps are efforts to try to represent physical space in some form. I've got a series of maps here I just wanted to show you, just to give you a sense of the variety of maps that different societies have produced. This is Isidore Saville's Map of the World. That's what Mappa Mundi means. This is from a text, a book that was reprinted in 1742, but the original map dates to the 7th century of the current era. And I don't know how well you can make this. Obviously, you've got your own PowerPoints to look at, but this is a very sort of abstract rendering of the world. Up there is Asia, there's Europe, there's Africa, and there's sort of two rivers here in the center, right? That's the Mediterranean, for instance. That's the Mediterranean. I forget what that other river is, but those are two rivers. And then it's surrounded by ocean. Remember, hadn't quite grasped the idea of the Earth as a globe, the Earth as a sphere. There's no representation here of the Americas. Those were completely unknown to Europeans at the time. It's a very abstract sort of map. And in fact, maps like this were used largely for symbolic reasons, but in some ways to help orient the viewer, especially toward the Holy Lands, which is why, for instance, Europe and Africa are here, and Asia is represented up top. You notice this is not; it doesn't have our sense of north, south, east, and west as we associate with maps. So that's a map. That's a representation. This is the map that the conquistador Hernando Cortez commissioned or made of the city of Tenochtitlan as the Spaniards came into the New World, came into what we today call Mexico City. But again, representation here in map form. Gerhard Mercator's world map. This dates to 1569, and this is, I think, it becomes the sort of standard map of the world for well into the 20th century. It becomes the standard map. And the features of it, for instance, you'll notice that the old world, Africa and Europe and Asia, full of information. You have to see this up close on your copy. But the Americas, which had just recently, within the last century or so, had been discovered, hardly any sort of information here. Some rivers, a few other bits of information, but this whole interior of the Americas, simply not understood. The other thing I want you to notice about this, though, is that in the Mercator projection, the Mercator map, the Europe as sort of at the center. Europe is placed at the center, and one of the things that does is that it alters, or it creates all kinds of distortions, about the size of Africa, for instance. If you've ever seen a Mercator map like this, it is distorted. Any flat map of the entire Earth will have distortions, and this is as much a design problem as anything. To turn a three-dimensional object into a flat, two-dimensional representation introduces all kinds of variations and all kinds of stretching and other sorts of distortions to the flat map. And we have Gerhard Mercator as much to thank as much as anything else. This is another kind of map, and I just draw this to your attention to give you a sense of the wide variety of maps that human beings have made. This is a map of a watering hole that we find that was made by Aboriginal peoples in Australia. And again, this is a map. I mean, and you may not have been able to figure that out if I hadn't told you it's a map, but it shows directions, it shows locations of particularly important places. So what I'm trying to do here, I guess, is to expand our definition, expand our notion of what a map is, what a map can look like. Same with this one here as well. This is the Marshall Islands, a stick map or a stick chart that was designed by one of the Marshall Islanders. This dates in 1974, but this map is fairly long-standing. When we say a map of the islands, this is in a sense a map of the seas around the islands. And you know, I don't know how to navigate something like this, but it shows you that maps can take different forms, different configurations. This is made of wood, for instance. Maps can take on all kinds of forms, all kinds of characteristics. The map itself can extend to the heavens. This dates, you'll notice, to 1090, to the 11th century of the current era. And it's an effort, again, to try to visualize the cosmos, right? Or the way in which Europeans would have understood the nature of the world. That's earth, that's air, that's water, that's fire over here. And this diagram was meant to represent the structure, the shape of reality. This is a very different kind of map, obviously, than some of the other ones we've looked at, which are tied very much to a physical space, a physical location. This is much more conceptual in its orientation. When you're talking about earth and water and air, for instance, this is a much more conceptual visualization or a conceptual diagram. And it's one of the key features that I want to say about information graphics, information visualizations, is that the space in which these symbols are located is much more abstract. It's not always a physical representation or representation of a physical space. That oftentimes these visualizations are depicting very abstract spaces. And in fact, in some of the examples I'm going to show you, the designer has to design the space first in which then to place different elements. And that's a very interesting kind of design feature, design element. Maps are represented. See, I have water even when I'm doing a video presentation. I have to have water with me. Maps are a representation of physical space or physical environment. This, I would suggest, and it's one of the earliest examples we have, this is a representation of a temporal environment or a visual representation of time. We call those calendars, and it's one of the first instances we found of a calendar. This is from the Roman era, from the Roman Republic, so you can see the dates here, 85 to 60 before the current era, BCE. And it's called a fasti, the name we give it is a calendar. Some features of this calendar will seem fairly obvious. So you see this is, and by the way, this is the original, this is a sketch of this, so you can make out some of the features. You can see it's arranged in columns, and you can probably figure out what these columns are. January, February, March, April. So these are months. But I want to show you an interesting feature of these Roman calendars. Along this column over here, actually, down this way, you'll see the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And then those are repeated again. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. So think about this for a second. You've probably already figured out what those are. If it's broken up into months, you can then probably figure out what those letters are. But let's think about this for a second. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. 8 days. The Roman calendar had 8-day weeks. And that's actually one of the more interesting phenomena, I think, in human history. We obviously organize our calendars in 7-day weeks for various cultural and other reasons. But that's exactly the point. Unlike a month, which has a reality in the movement of the moon around the earth, and unlike the day, which is the rotation of the earth, and unlike the year, which is the rotation of the earth around the sun, the week has no sort of physical counterpart. There's no sort of 7-day cycle, I guess, unless we take a 28-day moon and divide it by 4, but why divide it by 4? In other words, a week is as much a human invention. And I think that's what you're looking at here with Roman Fasti. We could have a week that's 8 days. Ugh, that'd be, unless it meant a longer weekend, I'm not certain I care much for that. But I wanted you to be able to see this design, and what this design is doing is turning time into a visual quality. It is turning time, the movement of time, and organizing it in a graphic or in a graphic space. But again, what is the actual space of time? Or does that space need to be developed, invented, and in fact can be shaped in all kinds of ways? And again, we're going to come back to this theme again and again and again. These are the chronicles, or so-called calendars of Eusebius. And it's really one of the first efforts of what we might call, or what we might think about as a chronology, or again, the movement of time. It's different from a calendar as such, although it's listed as a calendar. It's really meant to be more of a chronicle. So what you're seeing here are just sort of reports of what's happening that day, which is why we would call it maybe something like a timeline, except it's not a timeline, right? It's arranged in this sort of tabular form. And it's this tabular form in particular, or this tabular structure, that I wanted to draw to your attention, because these chronicles are one of the first instances we have of this kind of tabular organization to information. And of course, tables like this are so fairly commonplace, we hardly pay any attention to them today. By the time we get to the 15th century, the 14th century, 1300s, we start to see instances like this. This example, in fact, I was trying to find an example, an original copy from the 14th century, and I just haven't been able to find one. So this is a later version of what's called double-entry bookkeeping. And nobody in this class I know is an accounting major, but if you've ever taken accounting, one of the things you learn is double-entry bookkeeping. That was important for the commercial markets, especially among northern Italian cities as they grew. We talked about this on Thursday. As they grew in size, as they grew in economic sophistication, these kind of accounting methods were necessary. And double-entry bookkeeping basically looks at how much money you're bringing in, how much money you're spending going out. And these two numbers are supposed to be in balance. And in fact, you can sort of see here, or you can look in your example to see they are in balance. But this is a tabular organization of information. And again, this is something that dates to the European Middle Ages. We certainly see more and more instances of this as we approach the Renaissance and the modern period. But I wanted you to be able to see this sort of visual organization and to understand that it has a history. Human beings have been doing this since the beginning of time. There's a history here to this kind of tabular form. This dates, and again, this is in a printed book, but this dates to 1665. It's the so-called Bill of Mortality for the Great Plague. And this is literally, and it's kind of grotesque to say it, this is literally a list of the way in which people died, or how they died, or what causes they died during the Great Plague of 1665. And again, I wanted you to be able to note here the tabular structure. that again was a recent meaning within the last few centuries. This is not something we necessarily see among ancient peoples. That tabular structure is something that we live with today. If you do anything in Excel, you're working with a tabular organization of information whose antecedents date to the Middle Ages. One of the readings that I had for you today was from Manuel Lima, from his book Visual Complexity, Mapping Patterns of Information. And the chapter, at least the introduction to that book, is called The Tree of Life. And I wanted you to see, especially, the reason I wanted you to have this reading is so that you could have lots of visual examples of tree diagrams. What Lima does in this chapter and in other parts of his book, I think, is talks about how ubiquitous, how widespread are the use of tree diagrams in organizing information. And there's all sorts of instances in this reading about the ways in which trees appear. I'm not going to hold this up in front of the camera. You're going to have this there in front of yourself. But this is one of the examples that he includes in this chapter. But there are many, many others. And the reason I draw attention to tree diagrams here is to first of all talk about how widespread they are. And my guess is that even if you look at, say, modern textbooks, if you look in some of your science classes, for instance, you will find something like tree diagrams that will appear anytime you see a diagram. If you study linguistics, especially historical linguistics, and you look at the evolution of different languages or writing systems, they are often depicted as trees, as tree diagrams. There's something interesting, though, about the choice of tree as the sort of the visual metaphor. I'll just read this very, very briefly. This is on page 25 of Lima's reading. I'm in the first column, about 3/4 of the way down. Currently, the scheme still finds relevance in genetics, linguistics, archaeology, epistemology, philosophy, genealogy, computer science, and library and information science, among other areas. As the scholar Pollock eloquently puts it, as the traditions of Western and Christian Kabbalah clearly demonstrate, the tree operates very well as a symbol for many systems of belief. It really has grown into a kind of organizing principle for our human efforts to understand the world. And the tree as a visual metaphor can be found in lots and lots and lots of different academic disciplines, lots of different cultures. What does a tree provide as a kind of an organizing structure for knowledge? Almost all of the examples that Lima shows here are the use of tree diagrams to organize information, to organize knowledge. Does knowledge have an underlying structure? And is that structure in fact a tree? Or is that a visual convention that we use to shape and organize information? And again, remember a tree, there's a trunk, and that trunk has branches, and that branch has smaller branches. It's actually a fractal structure, if you remember that. But the point is that the best way to organize knowledge? Is that the best way to think of it? There's this sort of common trunk of knowledge that gets broken up into smaller and smaller and smaller branches. Is that the visual metaphor that we use to think about knowledge? And is that because that's the way knowledge is in fact actually organized? Or is the tree the metaphor, the visual metaphor we've chosen to represent and to try to understand and to make sense of knowledge? I'll let you ponder that one. Lima notes the system of the map of the system of human knowledge that appears in Diderot's Encyclopedia, and we've seen a couple of examples from Diderot's Encyclopedia. And by the way, so this tree diagram is broken up into memory, reason, imagination, with different branches underneath each one. Think of this as a more abstract kind of tree diagram. It's not an actual tree, as you're going to find in many of these examples. But for Lima, that's a tree nevertheless. I'm really struck by the fact that Diderot and D'Alembert referred to this as the map of the system of human knowledge. And maybe what they were doing is sort of expanding the idea of what we mean by a map to mean not just simply the representation of some physical space, but maybe even the representation of a much more abstract kind of space. It's really very interesting that they use the term map to describe this. At the same time, this is from the same collection, this is from the Encyclopedia as well. At the same time that they had this more abstract representation, they also had an actual tree. They drew an actual tree diagram, actually had someone else design an actual tree diagram. Remember what I said the other day, that the Encyclopedia was this 17-volume work that was meant to encapsulate all human knowledge. And there was this real mania for encyclopedias, I said, around this time, 17th, 18th centuries. Tree diagrams were one way to try to bring some order and structure and harmony to this vast array of knowledge. Those 17 volumes of printed text, how do we organize those visually? And again, the tree diagram is used as the way to organize and to make sense of that knowledge. These are just close-ups of the different branches. And you notice it's literally drawn as a tree with leaves and branches and those sorts of things. Again, Manuel Lima talks and has many examples in greater detail. But again, one of the themes I want to emphasize here is the nature of the graphical space, the way in which information is being organized. And oftentimes for these kinds of information graphics, the first thing you need to do is decide what is that space representing. If it's not going to be a physical terrain, well then what kind of space is going to be represented? We are not done, well, we are still trying to represent that sort of knowledge. This is that same tree diagram from the Encyclopedia, rendered in about a decade ago in computer form, computer graphic form. So we're coming up with new forms of display to try to understand the structure, the nature of knowledge. This is what you can see from the top, a discipline citation network. Nodes represent the different disciplines. The links represent citations from papers in different fields. And so you're understanding here the relationship between medicine and cell biology or neuroscience. And it's really interesting to see the way in which networks of different disciplines are linked to each other. But again, think about the nature of this information graphic. How is this space invented or imagined? What's the underlying form of knowledge? Or is that a form that the graphic designer gives to knowledge? I think it's the latter. And I think you're going to see this in a few other examples. I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at the work of William Playfair, who was who's sometimes held out as maybe the first graphic designer, maybe the first, and I'm not certain he's the first graphic designer, but he's certainly held out as the first information designer or statistical designer. And in fact, what he was doing was taking statistics and rendering these in visual form. Statistics was, in the 18th century, still a fairly new discipline, a fairly new idea. And the word statistics comes from, the root of that word is state. It's information produced by the state. So as governments were collecting data and information, statistics, someone like Playfair renders these in visual form to make them more intelligible, to allow us to make more sense of them. This is a representation, again you can sort of read this at the top on your examples, but this is the size of populations of different states and nations. That's what the circles represent. And then what you're looking at in these sort of red and yellow lines here are the revenues and sort of the outlays. It's sort of a balance of trade sort of arrangement. And that was something that Playfair was particularly interested in representing. The amount of goods that a country was exporting, the amount of goods that they were importing. And he was looking in particular at balance of trade. And you'll see that throughout a lot of the charts that he represents. This is one, as you can see, is a commercial history, meaning the activities, economic activities of various states. Those states are listed here along this axis, and then this is time along this axis. So and these black marks here represent sort of the rise and decline and the economic or other fortunes of each one of these societies. So this one down here is Egypt, for instance, right? Egypt, very, very strong, not so much today. Greece, Carthage, Rome. At the top, over here, by the way, is the United States of America. Nothing, 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 until you come to 1700. And then you see the United States dominating, Russia, England, France, Germany, Denmark. You can see the countries here. I find this a really interesting chart, and we're going to see other instances of this here in just a moment. But what I draw to your attention here is that this axis represents nations. This axis represents time. It was René Descartes who first developed in the 17th century the idea of the coordinate plane. And if you've studied geometry in high school, you know what a coordinate plane is, XY coordinates. Playfair was using the idea of XY coordinates in this way to represent statistics, where the X and Y coordinates don't have to represent physical location. Again, it's not the X and Y coordinates are not this way and this way mapping out a physical space, but the X and Y coordinates can represent abstract quantities, a nation state and time. And you're going to see other instances from Playfair as well. But now we're talking about a very different kind of graphical space, very different from, say, a map. Here's another one of Playfair's charts. This one showing the price of wheat. That's what these black marks here represent. This is the weekly wage of a sort of a typical worker. And the idea was to show that at various stages the price of wheat to make bread, which was central to his diet, was outpacing by a long margin his weekly wage. And one of the ways that a chart like this would have been used would be to show moments where there would be food or bread crises that could sometimes lead to political destabilization. But here's a visualization that shows this. And look at this. Look at all the information that's being represented here. So you have time along this axis, and you have sort of quantity along this axis. But by the same token, now you can represent sort of two quantities simultaneously and see the relationship between them. And that was what was so important about Playfair's diagrams. That now you could not just simply map out or visualize these abstract quantities, but now you could start to draw comparisons and to see patterns in those quantities. That was very clearly the case in this Playfair diagram. Exports and imports to and from Denmark and Norway to England, to the United Kingdom. That's there. So the red is exports, the yellow is imports. So and this is time along this axis, this is sort of quantities and amounts. And again, very quickly you're able to see that from 1700 to 1755 or so, there's a balance of trade against England, and since that time there's been a huge balance in favor to England. Something happens along here. Imagine these numbers set in a table. To be able to make that sort of visual comparison quickly like that is one of the advantages of Playfair's diagrams. And it wouldn't have been as evident. You could have figured out eventually. It's not as evident in a table of numbers. This is something that Playfair, through his design, makes readily and visually apparent. Here's another one, and it's a similar sort of chart that we just saw in the last case. Imports versus exports. This is to and from North America. And again, you can see moments where there's a balance in favor for England, where there's a balance against England. Again, time and quantity along each axis. But think about what these statistical charts, these statistical graphs allowed one to do. That by designing information in this fashion, you're able to very quickly see the story of the information readily. Always had a balance of favor in England, between England and Ireland. I share this diagram just to show other ways that time and quantity could be bent around. I was just struck by the circular nature of this chart. This is from Florence Nightingale. This is causes of mortality, in particular during the Crimean War. You can see the dates here that we're looking at. These are April of 1854 to March of 1855, April 1855 to March 1856. And so these are quantities represented here, but then we're also sort of seeing circular time represented in this way. And again, I just share this with you as another way of thinking about the design of the information. And again, these are graphic design choices that Nightingale and other designers are making about how information is to be organized. I want to get back to the idea of timelines. This is one of the dates to, we're going back in time again, 1534. What I wanted you to be able to see here is the representation of time as a line. And this gets us into questions about how you represent time in graphical form. And what was becoming fairly evident is that lines were a particularly good way of doing this. Hagelganz's Atlas Historicus, this also sort of represents time and space in this sort of two-dimensional graph. I'll come back to this in a second, because this is a particularly interesting chart of universal history, because I think that has all kinds of interesting things. There are historians that want to say that this is really our first timeline. It was Joseph Priestley who developed this timeline. As you can see, again from the title, a specimen of a chart of biography. And essentially, all he did, again, it looks really sort of simple. In fact, sometimes the best designs are the most simplest designs. But he essentially took the biographies of famous statesmen or men of learning, depending on where they are in this diagram, and then listed out their years, right? Their birth and their death years. And so with a glance, you can sort of see who's living about the same time, right? So that Cicero and Pompey and Julius Caesar and Brutus and Augustus, they're all sort of living around the same time. Although Cicero and Augustus here, Augustus was his adoptive son. So again, you can again see with one very easy visualization the relationship between all this kind of information. The best information diagrams, the best information graphics pack a lot of information within a relatively small space that can nevertheless tell you and show you relationships between those data. The best visualizations, the best information graphics have that quality. We're going to put that severely to the test when we talk about timelines, or timetables here, British timetables in just a second. Just another example of these timelines. This is a bigger version of what we just saw. These are the lives of individuals, but a much more complex sort of diagram. I said I wanted to come back to this diagram because this does something really, really interesting, which takes geographic space, which we've seen over here, and time along this axis, but then you add at the same time sort of the rise and fall of empires. And if you look here in particular, look at the Roman Empire. This isn't just simply Rome. This is Rome extending over all kinds of territory: Spain, France, Italy, Turkey. And then you watch the Roman Empire sort of decline right around here. You're actually watching the rise and fall of different empires as they expand over geographic space and contract, both in space and across time. It's a really, really complex information graphic that conveys an awful lot of information in a relatively simple space and allows us to see patterns in those data. I wanted to share with you two information graphics from Charles-Joseph Menard. And these are two, they've become, I think, fairly famous, even though they were designed in the 19th century. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the graphic designer Edward Tufte drew our attention to these really marvelous graphical forms. So these are maps. He calls them carte figurative. He calls them figurative maps. Carte is a map. So there's obviously a geographic space here that's being represented, right? That's what these are. So here's, the sea, rivers, these sorts of things. This sort of brown stripe shows Hannibal's armies marching on Rome. And the width of that line represents the size of Hannibal's army as he approaches Rome. And in fact, what you can see from this chart is they don't come anywhere near Rome. That's Turin right there, that's Milan. And a big reason for this is that the size of the army, as represented by that line, gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner as his army tries to get over hills, as they encounter resistance. And in fact, by the time they come into Turin, they're really, really quite small. So think about this for a second. You're seeing geographic space represented, so location, where they are at any sort of given time. You see the size of the army. You sort of see where they start, where they end, where they meet their ignoble end. It's a really complex map? Information graphic? Both? Neither? Here's one that's even more complex from Menard. And this is, for someone like Tufte, he really holds this out, is maybe one of the best information graphics of all time. He would make that claim. I think I would say it's certainly up there, one of the top 10, let's say. Similar sort of idea, similar sort of process, this time showing the advance of Napoleon's Grand Army to Russia, to Moscow and back. The idea was he was going to leave with, I think, something on the order of, I forget the number, like 400,000, 500,000 troops, march on Moscow. And so what you're seeing here, the sort of the brown line represents the march out to Moscow, and the black lines represent the retreat back to France. And as you can see, just from this graphic, it didn't turn out all so well for Napoleon's army, right? You can see how they sort of start off here. And what's interesting about this graphic is you can see where the army branches off in spots, in locations. And so you can see on the way back, things are not so great. This is overlaid. It may be hard to sort of tell, but this is overlaid on a map. You see rivers here. So this is a much more truncated sort of map, but it is nevertheless a map. And again, you see rivers and things. Here's another dimension of information right here, though. What you're looking at down here is the temperature, especially on the retreat back from Moscow. So this is what the temperature was at any given moment. And there's some spots where you can see it gets really, really quite cold. In fact, the cold becomes an important part of the reason why Napoleon loses so many men. It is one of the major reasons. But look what's happening here in this visualization. You have geographic space, you have the location of the army in that geographic space, you have a sense of their direction, you have a sense of the size of the army at any given point in time, and this is a representation of time, going out, coming back. Add to that the temperature on the way back. Think of all the dimensions of information, which is how graphic designers will talk about it. The dimensions of information represented in this seemingly very simple looking, hand-drawn, flat map. It is one of the more sophisticated information graphics that you're going to encounter. As we approach the 20th century, there have been all kinds of similar efforts to represent time in graphic form or graphical form. This is a fairly famous one, the cover of the Cubism and Abstract Art catalog, exhibition catalog from 1936. Alfred Barr Jr. designed this. And again, this was showing the relationship between different artistic and design movements in the early part of the 20th century. Obviously time, you have the references to different movements and the relationships between them. Maybe not as much information, not as much data as some of the other examples we looked at, but still a really interesting sort of graphic display. This I share with you as well. This dates to 2007, and it's by the artist, or maybe it's performance artist, Kini Lewis. There's a grid, it's probably hard to see here, but there's a grid represented on this wall. And essentially, what Lewis is doing is that grid is tied to different parts of the body. So every time she felt a sensation in a particular area on her body, she documented the feeling onto the corresponding place onto the grid with a pin and the date. And red strings linked together sensations that she felt were sort of synchronous. And so what she's developed here is a kind of a visualization of sensation. And again, think about the abstract qualities that are being represented here. And think about the nature of information diagrams or information graphics is to represent these kinds of abstract qualities. I wanted to share with you another, and I'm going to run through these examples a little more quickly, just because I wanted you to see lots of examples of musical notation. There are other historians that suggest that it's musical notation that really presents to us our first information graphics. Maybe it is something like music, because think about what a musical score does. It represents, I suppose, a physical sensation, sound or pitch, and it represents it visually in an invented graphic space. Think about what a musical notation system does. It allows you to locate a particular sound at a particular moment in time. It allows you to represent its pitch. It allows you to represent its duration. And it allows you to represent how it's to be played, the sound quality is to be played. And that's what musical notation is all about. Right? And so you should think of musical notation systems as a kind of information, or as an information graphic, as an information diagram. And I just share with you a number of these sorts of examples. Initially, musical notation, at least in the European context, musical notation began as sort of a supplement to writing. It looks very much like a written form. The difference being you had these extra sort of symbols placed there to represent the way in which you were to sound out, or the pitch at which you were to sing out those words. That's what you're seeing here, for instance, as well. Eventually, the staff itself is created in order to give a kind of visual order to those notes. Just another example. You can't see it here. You'll be able to see it, I think, in your examples, but there's red lines here that represent those staves. And again, notice the relationship to the words here. Just another example of that. Here's a clear example of that same sort of phenomenon. Now the notes are starting to take some precedent, although you notice the words still loom fairly large here. That is all handmade. Here's one where the music, the musical notation is sort of separated away from the text in important ways. But again, notice the graphical system that's being developed here. There is no rule that says, and if you've studied music, and I'm assuming that most everyone has seen musical notation, maybe has played music as part of their background. We are accustomed to a certain kind of visual form to musical notation. Those examples look fairly familiar to us. But there are other ways to organize musical notation. And I was particularly struck by this one. This is a system used for a lute that's used for oral storytelling in could be Mongolia, Tibet, but somewhere around the 19th century. This is essentially sort of a fingering system for the lutes. And these are meant to represent how you're supposed to finger the strings at various points. So again, you're sort of seeing musical time in this direction. Lots of different ways to represent musical notation. This also from Tibet. You can read over here what's being represented in the musical notation, but different forms of intonation. I'm really sort of struck by these because they're so different from the way in which we think about musical notation in the West. And in fact, there were some, especially in the 1960s and 70s, there were a lot of experimental musicians who, as part of their experimentations with sound and musical form, were experimenting with different forms of musical notation, about how we represent our sounds. So this is Bossati's, just called graphic notation. The question is this something that musicians actually use, or is this more sort of an art piece? It's making a statement about music. Not so, though, with Brian Eno's ambient music for airports. Each one of these are different compositions, each one using different musical notation. I'm not going to play these. I urge you to go to YouTube, though, and look up ambient music for airports for Brian Eno, and look at the way in which these are representations of musical sound. I'll just share this one. These are just different, if you know the effect in synthesizer music, it's a choir effect. So each one of these are different tones for a choir effect. And think of this almost as sort of running through time like this. So at any given time, This is the synthesized tone that you'll hear. So height here represents pitch, this is duration, and all of this is moving through time. The idea here was that he was experimenting with musical notation as a way to think about or to experiment with time. That is Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, a German avant-garde composer in the 60s and 70s, who similarly played a lot with synthesizer and computer music, and thought that there should be a new kind of notation to represent the kind of music that he was producing. And you're seeing examples there, and in this case as well, of his forms of musical notation. Really sort of complex kinds of notations like this. This is another one of Stockhausen's representations of his electronic music, elektronische Musik, as you can see right there. And so Stockhausen, in addition to playing with the technology of music and playing with different kinds of soundscapes, was also playing with the representation of those soundscapes. John Cage was an experimental musician as well, experimented with the nature of sound, and devised new sound systems, and also experimented with different forms of representation of musical sound. I can't interpret that. I just share it with you to show you that there's another way to represent musical sound, and this isn't just simply an abstract piece of painting. Here's another information graphic as well that I wanted to share. And again, part of the message here is, do we provide the shape, the physical form, or the visual form to knowledge, or is this a form that is sort of already pre-existing, and our graphic systems just simply represent these? This is the first sketch of the periodic table. And again, if you've studied chemistry, you know the centrality, the importance of the periodic table. This is Mendelev's first sketch up here. And it has sort of the forms that we kind of associate with the periodic table. This is as it appeared in his textbook, which dates 1869. And this doesn't look a thing like the periodic table that we understand today. And in fact, chemists have been designing different ways to represent the relationship between the elements, which is what the periodic table is supposed to do, to visualize the relationship between different elements. And in fact, the periodic table has taken on all kinds of different forms. This is one from 1887, as you can see, Levitsky's arrangement. Here's one from 1905, the periodic table from Gooch and Walker. Clark's periodic table, 1933. This is one from the 1950, I think, at an exhibition, the Festival of Britain exhibition. And again, each one of these are perfectly valid ways to represent the periodic table. Information graphics like this, because we're oftentimes dealing with abstract qualities or abstract entities, need to have a visual form devised first. Unlike a map, which is about the physical, about replicating or representing a physical, an actual physical space. All kinds of abstract quantities or qualities can be mapped or visualized. This is one effort, and I'll show you a couple others. This is one effort to try to represent all the digits in pi, the number, the constant, the irrational number, pi. There's a belief that if we could just visualize it properly, maybe we could find some sort of hidden order or pattern, and maybe it's not so random. You look at something like this and you wonder, maybe it is kind of random. I don't know. Or what if we represented the numbers this way? And the way in which this visualization, again, this is pi, the way in which this is created is to take, is to take the path, right? So you start here with 3.14159, those are the first few digits of pi, and just keep doing that throughout this space. Well, then you get this sort of representation of pi. Does it represent an order, or is it just simply beautiful to contemplate? That's how I tend to think of these sorts of diagrams. We'll talk, at the end of the semester, we'll talk about the digital world, the digital environment. This is a map of the internet, a visual representation, at least, of the internet. The number and quality and quantity of our information graphics has been skyrocketing since the development of the computer. This is, let me give you a little background to this. So as you can see, this is called Listen to Wikipedia, and we're going to do it here in just a second. But what I'm about ready to show you, or to demonstrate for you, is this site that turns Wikipedia edits into a visualization, but also a kind of soundscape as well. And I don't want you to play this now if you have a computer. I'm going to play it right here because it does make a sound, it does make a noise. But what you're going to be seeing here is these circles represent edits to Wikipedia. A green one is being done by someone who's not an authorized user or doesn't have an account. The purple ones are done by automated bots, but there'll also be a sound attached to it. So if you hear a string pluck, that means that something has been deleted from a Wikipedia article. If you hear a bell sound, that is something being added to a Wikipedia article. And then at moments, and this is happening in real time, so I don't know if it'll happen during the demonstration here, when someone registers for Wikipedia, you'll hear a drone sound like that. So I'm just going to play this for you here, just so you can get a sense of what it means to listen to Wikipedia. And go ahead and load for me. There you go. That's the drone. I'll let you play with that. That link is there. Actually, if you just click onto that, but that link is right here. And I'd recommend you listening to that, playing that. I will sometimes just play that in the background if I just want some background sound. It's actually, I find, very soothing for that reason. A couple other visualizations before we get to timetables very quickly. This is another visualization of the link structure within a wiki. And again, we've been doing more and more of these kinds of visualizations. And now I wanted to turn a brief amount of attention to the second article that I wanted you to look at, which is on the design of timetables in the 19th century in England. And these are train timetables. And so I wanted you to look at these, and there's all kinds of examples, all kinds of visual examples that I wanted you to look at. On the one hand, I wanted you to look at this article and the examples as another example of information graphics. And I want you to think about all the qualities we've been talking about with information graphics. How do you represent the location, the time at which a train is going to be appearing at a station across all these stations across England. There's all sorts of things to sort of point to here. On page 92, for instance, they talk about the ways in which timetables in Great Britain reordered, this is one of the terms here, reordered spatial awareness. And that the advent of railroads did this. We'll talk next week about railroads and the Industrial Revolution and the role that railroads played in reordering the way in which people experienced time. The way in which they experienced time. Their spatial awareness. On page 93, there's a definition of a timetable, an arrangement of information designed to show when events happen in relation to transport. Typically, they inform the user of the destinations between which the service runs and the time at which it leaves each calling point. That's the definition of a times table. And again, there are all sorts of examples here. On page 94, just underneath this one example, it says, representing this information in a timetable in linear sentences was possible. You could write this information out. but it would have taken up vast amounts of space. And the idea was to take all that information and to put it in a graphical form that would convey all the information, but to do it in a much more economical sort of space. And so what you're looking at here are lots of examples of this, but this article is as much about the design problems, the design fail that oftentimes happen, especially in the earliest forms of these designs. I will turn your attention to well, first of all, on page 99, to sort of show you some of the issues that they face. About halfway down the text, it says, "This was a trade-off between the physical constraints of the format and the functionality of the finished item, and one in which the functionality could suffer." And right above it, it says, "Crowded columns seem to be inevitably characteristic of timetables. They are narrowed down to limits which crush the figures within them into a black mass, and often in many pages obscuring the figures, at all times rendering them difficult to make out. Everything is so compressed." And a good chunk of this article is about the bad design that results from these problems. I mean, there were design problems that had to be solved here. And there were various efforts, many of them failures. Look on page 100. I'll hold it up, but I'd rather you see the timetable there on page 100. That is a definition of bad design. It's very difficult to look at and to read this. That is a design fail, to be sure. Page 101 shows a slightly better design, and one of the differences is in the way in which the letters would be weighted and the case and the larger type size that would be used. But think of these as all ways to solve a design problem. How do you depict lots and lots, a ton of information in a relatively small graphic space? And that's what these examples here were all about. So I want you to read through this article and again to look at both the design challenges and also the demands that were placed on users. This was a key part of what they were talking about here. Let me see if I can find this just real quick, where they talk about demands on the user. Page 104, near the top, it says, "According to an 1874 Times editorial, timetables were one of the expedients for making a multitude of people a machine. Thus, the passenger was disciplined by the demands of the capitalist or industrial economy. The timetable, as a representation of the industrial order of the railway system, demanded an efficiency and a rationality of the user." And this, after we talked on Thursday about the demands placed on the user of a goblet. To what degree do our designs place demands and expectations for certain kinds of behaviors on the part of users? And that's something that I wanted to draw to your attention here as part of this lecture. One other thing I included in the links in your Carmen page, we're not going to talk about it here, I just want to draw to your attention the history of the organization chart as another interesting sort of visualization, and I have an example for you there if you click onto that link in the Carmen page. So that's a whirlwind tour of information graphics. And again, for the graphic designers, but for everybody in the class, but for graphic designers and for graphic design, what sort of graphic designs do information graphics represent? They have certain qualities of maps. They have certain qualities of written systems as well. How do we characterize these different kinds of visual systems? And again, how might these different designs influence our graphic design work? Okay, that's it. Remember your midterm essays are due this coming Thursday. We've got the Dropbox already figured out. We can answer questions as well. Joseph and Darwin are here to be able to do that. I will be back in class on Thursday.